And you can't talk about race and race matters and diversity without wrestling with the legacy of white supremacy, in which it takes such tremendous courage to think critically about ourselves. That race is not some ghettoized peripheral issue. It has to do with the quality of persons that we think we are, the quality of American society that we think we are, and in the end, the quality of the species, humanity as a whole. Now, I'm sure many students here at this grand university will never forget those moments in which you look closely at your assumptions and presuppositions and recognize that your worldview rests on pudding. Fascinating attempt to see whether, in fact, American democracy could become a multiracial democracy. And we're still not even dealing with the vicious legacy of male supremacy, let alone class hierarchy. But to create a multiracial democracy in light of Lincoln's vision after he changed his mind. And yet by 1877, you all know the story, the Confederacy lost the war, but white supremacy won the peace.
Family, in my quest to empower black folks, to talk about black liberation, I have met works of different scholars from all over the world. They could be in Africa or even in America, but I am so obsessed with black liberation, and I've done a series of videos on the same. And on today's video, I just want to say prior that this is one of the best videos I have ever done. This is a video that I'd actually advocate for all black folks to watch. This is a video with a lot of insights for the black people. To speak to us today is Dr. Cornel West. Dr. Cornel West is one vocal scholar. This professor is just one for the books. In his book, in his book known as The Race Matters of 1993, a foundational book on race relations in America, published in the aftermath of the 1992 Los Angeles riots. In it, West critiques American democracy, capitalism, and white supremacy, while also challenging black leadership and cultural attitudes within black communities. Fam, this is a video that you must watch. So fam, I want you to watch this video of Dr. Cornel as he speaks about the black leadership, as he speaks about race issues in America. Once the video is done, we will get back and do a critical analysis about the same. Let's watch this, fam.
Who will muster the courage to use and deploy their critical intellect? I didn't say intelligence, I said intellect. Because Richard Hofstadter is right in his classic Anti-Intellectualism in America of 1963. America praises intelligence, but fears intellect. It's a business civilization. It's a market-driven civilization. Who has time to wrestle with the frightening questions? And of course, race, the vicious legacy of white supremacy, has been for so long a dogma in American history. We hit it hard in 1861, we hit it again in the 1960s, but for the most part, it's still one of those tacit assumptions and presuppositions we'd rather sidestep and hold at arm's length. Quest for self-knowledge. What kind of person are you and I really? What kind of community, what kind of nation are we really? Do we have the courage to look ourselves in the mirror candidly, critically, honestly, and acknowledge the underside, the night side of ourselves, the human predicament, American democracy, the world? William Butler Yeats is right when he says it takes more courage to dig deep into the abyss of one's own soul than it does for a soldier to fight on the battlefield. And you can't talk about race and race matters and diversity without wrestling with the legacy of white supremacy, in which it takes such tremendous courage to think critically about ourselves. That race is not some ghettoized peripheral issue. It has to do with the quality of persons that we think we are, the quality of American society that we think we are, and in the end, the quality of the species, humanity as a whole. Now, I'm sure many students here at this grand university will never forget those moments in which you look closely at your assumptions and presuppositions and recognize that your worldview rests on pudding. That's one of the differences between education and credentialization. That's one of the differences between acknowledging change, transformation, metamorphosis as a result of critical thinking and critically engaging the underside of who you are, the underside of American democracy. And yet at the same time, we recognize that it's so easy to fall back into those habits of thinking and expectation and orientation, business as usual. Now, granted, Socrates, like Jesus, never wrote a word, and I don't encourage that for undergrads or graduate students here. University of Washington, write your papers, put forward your nuanced formulations and sophisticated interpretations, adduce your evidence, draw your valid conclusions. Hope your professors understand the argument. And it's not really true, of course. Socrates did write at the very end of his life in prison a hymn to Apollo and versified the fables of Aesop. He began to take seriously that voice that he heard throughout his life. Socrates practiced music. Socrates practiced music. Maybe you need some art to free you from the tyrannical rule of reason that you think results in the level of self-mastery and control that allows you to control those deep appetites. But what's fascinating about Socrates, and it's pointed out by Leo Strauss in his 1958 lectures at the University of Chicago on the problem of Socrates, Socrates laughed once. If we take seriously the four sources that render the agent of Socrates, Plato's dialogues, profound, often unpersuasive, Xenophon's less profound but fascinating dialogues, of course, the satirical depiction of Socrates in the Clouds by Aristophanes, and of course Aristotle's cold and disinterested analysis of Socrates' views. But he laughed once when he was asked, "How should we bury you?" And he said, "Anyhow, if you can catch me." But that's interesting to me. He laughed once, and not only that, but we never find that he wept as much as once. No tears. Married to Xanthippe, 3 sons, no tears. As important as thinking critically is in relation to wrestling with the legacy of white supremacy, the Socratic embodiment of the legacy of Athens is a necessary but not sufficient condition for wrestling with race. And that's why I take seriously the legacy of Jerusalem. Jeremiah wails and Elijah cries and Jesus weeps because they love so deeply, they care so much. And we will never be able to come to terms with race matters unless we confuse a spirituality of genuine questioning, interrogating, scrutinizing, pushing ourselves against the wall, but at the same time allowing tears to flow precisely because one has to open one's soul and acknowledge one is not always in control. Some passion, some connection to something bigger than oneself, to situate oneself in a story larger than oneself, to be able to locate oneself in a narrative grander than oneself, break out of the egocentric predicament. Exactly. Exactly. They acknowledge that reality of the other, capital O, that Levinas, Simone Weil, Dostoevsky and Ellison and Toni Morrison encourage us to do. How do we bring together the spirituality of genuine critical questioning with the spirituality of genuine compassion and service to others? And by spirituality, I'm not talking about some ephemeral phenomena. I know in the academy when people talk about spirituality, think of New Age and a whole host of other popular phenomena. But no, by spirituality, I mean self-involved and self-invested struggle that takes us outside of our own self and connects us to others, ideals, causes, movements, social momentum. And of course, I could simply provide a grand example of that spirituality of critical questioning and spirituality of deep love and compassion by turning on John Coltrane's Love Supreme and just sit down. Just shut my mouth. I'll read a chapter, Toni Morrison's Beloved. I keep track of that American Hamlet, Blanche Dubois, the streetcar named Desire, that white blues brother born in Columbus, Mississippi, named Tennessee Williams. Meaning what? Meaning that as artists, they exemplify both the Socratic moment on the one hand, but also the prophetic moment on the other. Condition of truth is to allow critical intellect to be displayed and enacted. Condition of truth is to allow suffering to speak. That sits at the center of the struggle for freedom, and especially the struggle for freedom of people of African descent. It's two fundamental questions that sit at the very core of that struggle. And of course, it's always a tradition of struggle that says, whosoever will, let him or her come, if you're willing to pay the cost. If you're willing to make a fundamental decision to keep track of the humanity of each and every one of us, whatever the evil, white supremacy, male supremacy, vast economic inequality, national arrogance, class haughtiness, losing sight of the humanity of disabled people, elderly, gay brothers, lesbian sisters. This is not cheap PC chit-chat. We're talking about historical challenges. When I think back to Harriet Tubman's and Ida B. Wells Barnett's, A. Philip Randolph's, Martin King's, Fannie Lou Hamer's, white brothers like Miles Horton. I'm sure they have his autobiography, The Long Haul, in this glorious library here. Hope it's been checked out repeatedly. Lydia Maria Child, a white sister that wrote appeal in favor of that class of Americans called Africans in 1833, responding to the great David Walker's appeal of 1829. They're wrestling with first the question of what does it mean to be human? Especially in light of a vicious of white supremacy in which people's humanity is perennially called into question, interrogated, has to be proven, never taken for granted. Told they have the wrong hips and lips and noses and hair texture and skin pigmentation, and the world begins to believe it. Told they're less beautiful, less intelligent, less moral. Rationalizations for subjugation and subordination. Enslavement, Jim Crow, Jane Crowed, discriminated against. Not solely as victims, our right-wing brothers and sisters are wrong. Never solely as victims. The victimization has been in place, but the sense of agency has always been exercised and enacted. When you look at the best of the struggle for freedom in the midst of this American civilization that presupposed that it was the exemplar of freedom and liberty. What does it really mean to be human? Now, you all know from your classes here that the English word human derives from the Latin humando, which means burying. Burying, I like to remind professors of humanity about that. You know, you are the ones into those bodies in the coffin. Those bodies that are now the culinary delight of terrestrial worms. Yes, why? Because at that particular moment, the three dimensions of time are brought together, past, present, and future, especially in a civilization so obsessed with futurity. but shuns the past and views the future as simply a repetition of the present, and doesn't want to view that future as qualitatively different, forcing us to interrogate the most fundamental and basic institutional and structural arrangements, just everybody fitting in, even as things become more colorful among the middle and upper middle classes and well-to-do, but the class hierarchy still in place. Their imperial policy still in place, oftentimes, though not always. What does it really mean to be human? Well, you see, when you actually look at the history of spirituals, oh Lord, how come I born here? So Sophoclean in insight. Or the blues, or jazz, or rhythm and blues, and yes, even a little hip hop too. They remind us that we are fundamentally two-legged, linguistically, two-legged. Let me say that again. I want you to get this point. I want you to get this point. That we are fundamentally two-legged, featherless, linguistically conscious creatures born between urine and feces. You see, that's the discourse of the funk in the history of black freedom. It's not something to be laughed at. See, when Ezra Pound said that Walt Whitman is an exceeding stench, but he is America, and he's from Idaho, you know. He said it in London. Black folks say, no, you think the stench and the stank is where you start. No. We start with the funk. We start with the raw history, the raw reality, and the mortality denied by most of American culture and civilization. That we are a people who have been on intimate terms with forms of death in the most death-denying, death-ducking, and death-dodging of all modern civilizations. The mainstream may go sentimental and talk about purity and he or she who is pristine and opt for the happy ending, but we start with slavery, a form of social death in the midst of this death-denying civilization. And one of the reasons why it's so difficult to talk about race and the legacy of white supremacy, one of the reasons why we usually have to wait for a catastrophe and crisis to hit before we wrestle with the issue head on, is because we live in such a shallow and hollow culture that is so obsessed with comfort and convenience and contentment, they don't want to deal with the funk. They don't want to deal with the raw reality. They don't want to deal with the darkness that is shot through, not just America, but every civilization. It's no accident that Disneyland and Disney World brag that no one has ever died on their premises. It's quintessentially American. If nobody died, is there life there? No, it's just fun. Oh, yes. The great Heidegger in his book of 1939, Homo Ludens, says fun was a term constructed and concocted in America. What a privileged and spoiled folk to think that somehow they can make it through history and not confront the tragic and comic dimensions of the world. Remain sentimental, skate through history in the form of what? Absolute denial, for the most part, of the forms of death. It's no accident the U.S. Constitution doesn't even refer to slavery, slaves, or Negroes. And you've all seen Joseph Ellis's new book, Founding Brothers. It's on the bestseller list. Surprised me. America's a strange place. Because it's a serious book, and you don't usually see serious text on that list. Take a look at that chapter 3 called The Silence and the consensus of the Founding Brothers to not come to terms with the petition of the Quakers to deal with slavery. Sidestep it. Overlook it. 22% of the inhabitants of the 13 colonies enslaved Africans. but somehow think that, as Malcolm used to say, the chickens won't come home to roost, that history won't haunt you. The same is true in the discourse of innocence. America is unique among modern nations to believe that it began with innocence. F.O. Matheson, the towering Harvard literary critic and Christian socialist and gay brother who taught in Cambridge for 42 years, used to begin many of his lectures by saying, would America be unique among modern nations to move from perceived innocence to corruption without a mediating stage of maturity? That's a serious question. You might grow old and you might grow big, but when will you grow up? Race is a litmus test, not just for justice, it's a litmus test for maturity. Peter Pan mentality, young forever. No history, no time, no mortality. Selective memory. And yet we know, 1861, we fight a war over an institution not even invoked in the Constitution. 13th Amendment refers to an institution not even alluded to in the Constitution. Mendacity. Hypocrisy. So, oh, Brother West, you're a little hard on America. It's a much more complex place than that. Yes, it is. Yes, it is. First 72 years of the Republic, 49 years, were headed by presidents who were slaveholders. The only presidents re-elected during that period were slaveholders. The majority of Supreme Court were Southerners, most of them slaveholders. Very complicated democracy. Seneca put it so well when he said that he or she who learns how to die unlearns slavery. Montaigne says to philosophize is to learn how to die. Plato has Socrates say philosophy itself is a meditation on and preparation for death. Because to live critically, intensely, and abundantly is to confront forms of death. You can't produce spirituals in the blues, or Sarah Vaughan, or Curtis Mayfield, without wrestling with the legacies of forms of death with which people of African descent have had to wrestle with. They're not the only ones. I'm just using this one example because there's such an exemplary group in this regard. You see, 1861, war. And I think about the discussion these days about the flag in South Carolina and Mississippi. And I say to myself, my God, what an impoverished discourse. To think that that flag is fundamentally about black pain on the one hand and the valor of white soldiers and the Confederacy on the other. Nobody wants to say it, but it was about the possible death of American democracy. It was the violent, organized insurrection to overthrow the U.S. government. And that's not the Black Panther Party, that's the Confederacy I'm talking about. It had to do with notions of democracy and citizenship. It's not just about black folk over here and white Southerners over there. You didn't even hear it articulated because our imagination when it comes to race is so eviscerated. The denial is still so much at work that it's just about responding to the psychological sensitivities of this group. And the psychological sensitivities of this. No. Race has been, we know, not just the most explosive issue, not just the most difficult dilemma, not just America's rawest nerve. It has the capacity to ring down the curtain on American democracy. It almost did. And it may almost again. Every chocolate city is a ticking time bomb. Cincinnati is just the peak of an iceberg. Just the peak of an iceberg. We'll debate later. Meaning what? For 4 years, 620,000 people dead. Over what? Legacy of white supremacy in the form of a slaveocracy. More Union soldiers dead than all American soldiers in World War II, each life precious. That's how deep it cut. We didn't even raise the question of what it means to be a citizen in a democratic republic in any systematic way until we raised the question, what are we going to do about these ex-slaves? What is their status? That's how deep it cut. That's how integral. That's how constitutive race has been and is in the American past and present. But it's so easy to push it to the side and think that somehow the rich promise and possibility of American democracy can be enacted without confronting that legacy head on. And of course, for 12 years, America did something that was unprecedented in American history, and we see it in the development of Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln was very honest, of course. You recall that moment when he meets with Frederick Douglass in 1862. Frederick Douglass goes, he writes in his journal, "It's the first white man I met who feels thoroughly at home with black people." Reminds you of Bill Clinton a little bit, actually. Abraham Lincoln says what? He says, "Mr. Douglass, I admire your oratoric skill." He said, "But I've been living for over 40 years with my white fellow citizens, and I'm thoroughly convinced that the vast majority of them will never, ever treat the masses of black people decently and equally. And therefore, it's best for you to look for a place in Central America. New colony." Frederick Douglass says, "I disagree with your conclusion, but I understand your insight. We got a major challenge if we're going to create a multiracial democracy." Part of the greatness of Abraham Lincoln, of course, was that, like Malcolm X, he was always growing. He was criticizing himself. By 1865, he changed his mind. He said, "I've decided to support the right of Negroes to vote in New Orleans, Louisiana. I think we might have a chance to create a multiracial democracy. It's going to be very, very difficult. Something that even the founding fathers would not affirm." And of course, 3 days later, a white supremacist with mediocre acting talent, John Wilkes Booth, put a bullet in his head because of that decision. Because of that decision. And yet there was this grand attempt. Never in the history of the modern world had there been a shift from slave status to citizenship status. And of course, in the 1870s, we had more senators then than we do now. Lieutenant Governor of Louisiana, head of Supreme Court of South Carolina. Fascinating attempt to see whether, in fact, American democracy could become a multiracial democracy. And we're still not even dealing with the vicious legacy of male supremacy, let alone class hierarchy. But to create a multiracial democracy in light of Lincoln's vision after he changed his mind. And yet by 1877, you all know the story, the Confederacy lost the war, but white supremacy won the peace. Institutional terrorism sets in. Jim Crow, Jane Crow, American barbarism. For 51 years, every 2.5 days, some black child, black woman, black man hanging from some tree. Strange fruit the southern trees bear that Billie Holiday sang so beautifully about. Just at the moment when America is constituting itself as a transcontinental empire with Guam and Cuba and Philippines, Hawaii. Just at the moment when Europe's poor, God bless you, begin to make their way into the cheap labor markets of the United States to help facilitate the economic takeoff of the country. Legacy of white supremacy, immobilizing these people, sharecroppers, day laborers, tenant farmers, peonage, limitless debt. Probably in many ways the most un-American condition inability to move. America's all about mobility.
Family, many a times, people avoid to speak about race issues. Many a times, people just do not want to talk about it. White folks are always angry when you talk about matters race. They play the race card. They play the reverse racism card. They say that black folks are always complaining about race time and again. Black people always shy about speaking about issues of race. Look at America right now. Black people many a times go through discrimination. We go through a lot of racism. You know, we go through a lot of these prejudices, and this has been a thing since the days of slavery. Black folks have been put through a lot of things. The days of slavery, colonialism in Africa. Right now we are going through a lot of discrimination and a lot of racism, and I just like to advocate for black people to come together. I like to advocate for black liberation. I like to say enough is enough, and having to see works of people like Dr. Cornel, I just feel this is it, because black people are going through a lot. Do we have the courage to look at ourselves in the mirror and acknowledge the underside of ourselves, the human predicament of American democracy? Can we look at ourselves and talk about it? Can we look ourselves in the mirror and say that indeed we have an underside as black folks? Black folks have been going through a lot. It's time that we talk about these issues. It's time that we address these issues, It's time that we come together. Many a times, as we complain time and again, the white folks are always close together. They support each other. It's time that now, before we even fight for liberation, before we even fight for our rights, before we even fight for equality, the first thing that we must do is for us to come together. Support each other. I always tell black folks, it's easier for us to build a community amongst ourselves and being able to enrich each other. Is it opportunities? Let's give each other opportunities. Is it that one of us has a problem? Let us all come together, to solve this issue. Some of the things that Dr. Cornel has discussed is the issue of black leadership. Many a times we think that if we have black leaders in the bigger stage, the black problems would be sorted. But that has not always been the issue. Many a times when the black leader goes there, they are always the puppet of the white supremacist. Look at the days of President Barack Obama. There was a lot of hope from all over the world. There were a lot of celebrations, including in Africa. Barack Obama roots from my village in Kenya. The village, everyone was celebrating. Everyone expected a lot from him. We knew that this is it for black liberation. We knew that this is an end of operation, an end to racism. But now when he went there, he was being controlled. He was a puppet for the people who were on top. I assume the white supremacists. There's been a lot that has been going on. You can't talk about race and race matters and diversity without wrestling with the legacy of white supremacy in America. There's a lot of supremacy. We thought that having our leaders in the biggest stage, in the White House, would solve our problems. The house is already white. That just shows you that there is a lot to black liberation. Here are some of the key themes in his book, or in Dr. Cornel's book of The Race Matters. Number one is the crisis of black leadership, just like I've mentioned. West criticizes black leaders for prioritizing personal gain and media influence over grassroots activism and structural change. It distinguishes between leaders who genuinely fight for racial justice and those who exploit racial tensions for political or financial benefit. Some of these leaders go there and only think of themselves. Then number two, we have the pitfalls of nihilism in black America. He highlights nihilism, a sense of hopelessness and despair that pervades many black communities, arguing that it stems from economic deprivation, racism, and the breakdown of social institutions. He calls for revival of love, hope, and community engagement as a response to this crisis. There's a lot of pitfalls and nihilism in America. There's a lot of sense of hopelessness and despair amongst black folks in America. And he advocates for hope. You know, let's support each other. Let's give each other hope. Even in those times that we think that our issues cannot be solved. Even in those times that we constantly go through racism and all these forms of prejudices against us. Those times that we are being discriminated, we need each other. Let's give each other hope in those timings. Then number 3 is the race and class in American society. West critiques both conservative and liberal approaches to race. He argues that conservatives blame black people for their struggles, while liberals fail by focusing on government programs without addressing deeper cultural and spiritual issues. Then number 4, we have the black sexuality and identity. He discusses this, how stereotypes about black masculinity and femininity affect relationships, self-esteem, and political movements. He critiques how mainstream media and American culture reinforce negative images of black people. Then he proceeds to talk about the role of Malcolm X and the black radicalism. West praises Malcolm X for his emphasis on self-respect and empowerment, but also argues that a new vision is needed for contemporary struggles. Last but not least is hope, love, and community building. West concludes that true racial progress requires love, compassion, and community-based activism, rather than simply political or economic strategies. Race Matters remains one of the most important books on race in America, shaping discussions on black identity, justice, and activism. Have you read it, or are you looking to read this book? Fam, this is a book that I think can be very, very impactful for black folk from all over the world. Guys, thank you so much for tuning to watch today's video. I do not take your support for granted. Guys, kindly like this video so that it can be recommended to other YouTube users. Comment down below. Let me know what you think about the teachings of Dr. Cornel when it comes to matters race. Race matters is an issue that has been constant over the years, but we tend not to find a permanent solution rather to this problem. Myself, I believe that it's a temporary one. We can be able to handle it by first starting to work on ourselves, starting to love ourselves, starting to care for our black brothers and sisters. That to me will be the biggest solution ever. Guys, thank you so much. Subscribe to the channel for amazing works around black history. Thank you, and see you all in my next episode. Goodbye.